Okay, it is 10 o'clock, so I say let's get started. Good morning and welcome back to everyone who has already joined us this week, and welcome to everyone who is maybe just joining us today. We're excited to have you all here for the third webinar in this three-part series happening this week as part of New Hampshire Flood Safety Awareness Week. This webinar series was created and being brought to you by the New Hampshire Silver Jackets, and will highlight our New Hampshire Flood Hazard Handbook, which was a guide that was created by the New Hampshire Silver Jackets team for local municipal officials. So again, just like yesterday, we're going to start with some quick housekeeping items real quick. So for those that are just joining today, or as a reminder, my name is Katie Pate, and I'm the Floodplain Management Program Coordinator within the New Hampshire Office of Planning and Development. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the New Hampshire Office of Planning and Development's YouTube page. Cameras and microphones are turned off for all attendees, but there will be time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. So at that time, you'll be able to raise your hand and you'll be able to unmute yourselves if you do want to ask a question verbally. If not, feel free to put any questions or comments in the chat throughout the webinar as we go. If you do have any technical issues throughout, feel free to put it in the chat and somebody will be able to help you as soon as we're able as well. So as we've covered, this is a third webinar in the series. Today's webinar will cover the topic of after the flood and will provide information for local officials to understand short-term and long-term recovery, considerations to rebuild safer and stronger, and then also prepare for future floods that may be coming. So the first webinar, if you haven't heard already, was originally scheduled for this past Tuesday, but due to the nor'easter that came through, we did reschedule that to be held tomorrow, March 17th at 12, which is noon. So if you have already registered, please feel free to join that webinar just using the link that you used, that you originally got in your email for Tuesday. If not, once I get through this intro slides, I will just pop in the chat the registration link for that as well, so you can register if you haven't. So again, this will look familiar if you were on yesterday, but we're just going to go through this really briefly. The New Hampshire Silver Jackets is a state-led team that was formed in 2015 and brings together state and federal agencies to focus on flood risk management issues that do affect local communities. Our team includes representatives from over 15 agencies and programs federally and at the state level as well. Included on the slide is the Silver Jackets website. And again, I'll also put that in the chat in just a few minutes as well in case you want to check it out. So here is our agenda for today. So first, we're going to cover the New Hampshire Flood Hazard Handbook again briefly, and then we'll have a series of presentations, which will include from the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, the New Hampshire Department of Business and Economic Affairs, myself, and then also from FEMA as well. And then at the end, we'll have Q&A once again, where anybody can ask any questions they may have. So first, again, we're going to start with a poll question just to see if we have anybody else new on here from yesterday that wasn't able to answer this. So if you give me 1 second, I'm going to launch it. Okay, so you should hopefully be seeing the poll question on your screen at this point. But the poll question is, have you seen or are you aware of the New Hampshire Flood Hazard Handbook? So the answer options are, I'm familiar with it and knew of it prior to this webinar series. I first heard of it in this week's webinar series, but plan to utilize it in the future. Or what handbook? Never heard of it. This is the first time I'm being brought to my attention. So I'll give everybody just a few seconds to answer. Good, we're getting lots of answers, and thank you everybody for answering that. But 1 more second. Okay, I'm not seeing any more responses, so I'm going to close that poll. So thank you. So it looks like the majority of people knew about it prior to this webinar. So again, that's great. Hopefully this will give you some more information about what's included in that handbook. And then for those that have just heard about it in this week's webinar, you know, that's a great opportunity to learn what's in it and then also take that handbook and use it moving forward as well. So again, in 2019, the New Hampshire Silver Jackets released the Flood Hazard Handbook for municipal officials. This publication was designed to help New Hampshire communities prepare for, respond to, and then recover from floods. It includes guidance, best practices, and information about available federal and state resources and organized into the situation-specific sections. So those 3 sections include before the flood, during the flood, and after the flood, which is what this webinar series highlights, those 3 sections as well. So also included in the flood hazard handbook is a customizable flood response and recovery checklist that can be used by municipal officials to identify and manage priority activities when a flood does happen. The flood hazard handbook, excuse me, is available online in PDF form as well as in print for community officials. So I'll put the link in the chat for the PDF, the online version, but we do have printed copies available. So if you are interested, your community, in gaining one of those and you didn't mention it on the webinar yesterday, feel free to let us know and we'll be able to work out a way to get you a printed copy as well. So I think now we're going to move over to our first presenter from the Department of Environmental Services. And Steve, I believe that is you. Perfect.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, my name is Steve Doyen. Thanks, Katie. I'm from the Department of Environmental Services Dam Bureau. The role that I serve here as Chief Dam Safety Engineer is to oversee the routine inspection of the state's hazardous dams, of which there are probably about 800 or so of those. We're also overseeing permitting activities for the new construction or reconstruction of dams. And we also have a river restoration coordinator who facilitates removal activities with owners who have elected to go that route. Because as you might expect, lots of dams in the state reach their end of life, or they have repairs needed that are considerably more costly than an owner's alternative to remove the dam and be done with it forever. What I'd like to talk to you today about will be ice jams and dams in terms of their impacts on flooding and what you might do to prepare for, monitor, and sort of after the fact do related to these two issues to maybe improve things for yourselves and for the community as a whole. So let me go to the next slide. Okay, so from an ice jam perspective, there are generally two types that we see here in the state. There are freeze-up jams, which are essentially are ice jams that are caused by extreme cold. You see slow-moving water start to freeze at those times, that action, and if that ice sheet gets very competent, it could then cause complications with flow. So you could see just general flooding based on the ice dam itself forming. Another type of jam, and if we're going to have one this year, and I'm hopeful that we won't, I don't think we will, but it's always possible, are breakup jams. And that's when the ice sheet starts to deteriorate in the springtime or as temperatures rise. Basically, the action of the water will break it up and it'll start moving downstream as a chunky mass. And you can imagine the problems that could develop based on that. Generally speaking, ice jams will form in areas where there are transitions or impediments in the stream. For example, a steep segment coming into a flatter section. Much like siltation, when you get to that sort of area, things slow down. So in those locations, ice can start to form or pile up. Sites near the confluence of two or more rivers, because what's happening in one river and what's happening in one that's adjoining it could be entirely different. For example, the host river could be jammed with ice, so any ice coming down the tributary could then start to back up, causing problems in its own. Sharp bends, obviously. Think of a pipe. Sites with reduced capacity to pass water because of sediment deposition, or really shallow sections where you could have ice actually anchored to the bottom of the stream. Any impediment like a bridge culvert or any other kind of crossing where the river goes from a relatively wide cross section to a narrow one. And in generally speaking, this last bullet here is kind of an example of a breakup. You have a sharp increase in air temperature in the springtime. Likely the ice sheet has been sort of decomposing up until that time. And then you may get a heavy rain on top of that, which increases river flows. All of these actions essentially contribute to making that ice sheet want to break up and move. So you tend to see those activities, a breakup in the springtime. Of course, you could have a winter thaw. We do get those on occasion as well. So what can you do? Now that you have an idea of where, when, and how they form, we can do some things maybe to prep. So you've got activities that may lead to ice jamming in your community. My anticipation is that for those of you who are municipal officials, you already have a good handle on the nature of your rivers and streams, where you have problems. For example, if you get 2 inches of rain, this house or this road or this culvert has problems. Maybe not so much on ice because ice jams are a little less frequent, but certainly, you can start keeping tabs on such things in your community so that you can monitor and react as necessary. So, for example, making assessments to identify potentially impacted structures along the river. If you know where these activities are likely to occur, or you have homes that necessarily are impacted frequently because of flooding, well, they might also be impacted because of ice jamming. So keep tabs on those. Certainly contact resource agencies like Homeland Security, DES, and the National Weather Service, because if you start seeing the development of problems, for example, the National Weather Service can issue flash flood statements so for the community indicating that there could be a problem or they could be seeing some high water. Again, preparing for reactions. You can stage assets, people, barricades, equipment, signage, so that if you do need to implement such activities, they're ready to go. Again, keep tabs on any dams or any jams that form. If you start having a jam accumulate, then keep tabs on it, visit it often, and make your decisions accordingly. And this bottom note here, Yosemite Sam is not somebody you want to call when you want to take care of an ice jam. Using explosives, it's sort of like trying to paint a barn with a cup at a time. It may take a problem, very local problem or amount of ice out, but it's not generally going to do much in the way of helping you get rid of the ice jam, because usually these are very large in nature. And secondly, using mechanical equipment. I mean, unless the ice jam is right at the base of a culvert that you can reach from the top of the road, generally getting equipment out on the ice and trying to make such ice move is not necessarily a safe activity. Okay, so let's transition to dams and how preparedness can aid in monitoring and in response for these structures. So first thing you should do is know the dams in your community. Use DES as a resource. We have a listing of all jurisdictional dams in the state. So you should have a corresponding list so that you know how many high, significant, or low hazard dams exist in your community, so that you can do such things as reach out to owners in advance of such events and say, hey, you have a high hazard dam in my community. I am charged with responding to events associated with incidents at your facility. Can I come over and look at it? Can we talk about it? How do you operate it? Certainly doing things like that can put you ahead of the game if you ever have to do some sort of response. As these dams that I talked about, high and significant hazard dams require that they have an emergency action plan prepared by the owner. These plans generally dictate how the owner will respond to potential emergencies. It provides much information to communities to use. For example, each EAP has an inundation map so that communities can use those maps to see what areas downstream might be impacted should the dam fail. So again, having that inundation map will help you develop things like an evacuation plan. Development of such plan does not fall on the owner. It falls on the community that needs to do the response. Let's see. Again, reaching out to dam owners, documenting trouble spots. Again, you know your communities and your rivers better than we do, so you should already have a good feel of where your likely problems are. But again, reaching out to dam owners and knowing the dams in your community can sort of help you plan for those very unlikely events where dams have issues. Okay, so getting to dams during an event here. So let me just start by saying the photographs on the right side relate to an event that occurred in the state in 2007. That dam is Hayden Mill Pond in Hollis. And as you can see, and I don't think the top picture was actually taken during the peak of the event, but essentially it's a very old mill dam constructed originally with granite blocks on the front and on the back, just filled with rubble material in the middle. Over the course of its life, the upstream side of the dam was replaced or augmented with a concrete wall, which I think kept this dam in place, because when I showed up on site to look at this, I really had a hard time seeing how this dam was remaining standing, because essentially it's just a sieve at this point. And the lower photograph there is the owner elected to remove it. I think a very smart choice on the part of the owner. So that's what that site looked like shortly after the removal. Okay, so you have a flood and you have dams in your community. What can you do? Certainly keep tabs on the weather. If you've already had a lot of rain and more is coming, you can expect more problems, generally speaking. Perform windshield surveys. Just get your folks out into the community, looking at the rivers and streams, seeing if they're rising, how fast they're rising. Maybe establish locations to track the amount of that rise if that's important, because again, you probably already have trouble spots in your community where certain properties or roads go underwater after a certain amount of rain or at a river flow. Maybe you can mark bridge abutments or install staff gauges in strategic locations to give yourself a better idea if you're getting close to that reaction standpoint. Reach out to abutters who might be impacted. Again, like ice jams, stage your resources. If you think you're going to respond or have to respond in some degree to a flood-related or dam-related issue, get your ducks in a row beforehand so that you're not wasting time when the event actually occurs. And again, use your resources, DES, Homeland Security. We maybe provide information. Homeland Security certainly can provide resources to you. So, you're not alone out there for sure. Okay, well, wrapping everything up together, we've got so things have occurred. You've had an ice jam, you've had a flood that may have involved a dam situation, and you're through it now. So, you're taking a deep breath. You're probably involved in a whole lot of other things right now, repairing roads or whatever else comes after such an emergency. But it's important not to lose sight of the factors that maybe went into making that emergency either less definable or more difficult to react to. So in the case of ice jams, make sure you have a very good location of where they formed. So after the event has occurred and the ice jam is gone, we'd like to get out there as soon as possible to take a look at those sites to maybe determine why the ice jam formed in that location. Because in the rare instance, you may be able to look at a site and say, well, this obstruction or this condition may have led to that jam and it may lead to future jams. So maybe there's a physical activity that you can take, that you can accomplish between now and the next ice formation period and maybe eliminate or lessen future damages. And again, if it's not safe to get out there right after the event, certainly make sure that somebody gets out there in the summertime, because again, inspection may be facilitated in drier weather. Again, hopefully during the event, you were monitoring any dams that had issues. You were in contact with dam owners that you needed to be in contact with. How did those dams perform? Any information that you have or can garner for that will make, again, potentially your response next time better. Were there any EAPs activated? Because again, an EAP begins when somebody senses a problem, most likely the owner, although sometimes it can be a member of the public, and they call 911. So the flow chart gets initiated, and you as a community, if you're impacted, should be on the flow chart. So you should be getting a call. If you didn't, that's a problem. So we need to look into issues like that. Were there any other aspects of the emergency action plan that didn't work well for you, or that were inaccurate as you went through and tried to respond? Again, we should try to take care of those issues. Communication, regardless of whether or not the flow chart was efficient, and I would have to say that 95% of them are. When the 911 call occurs, everybody else in the flow chart usually gets called unless there's some breakdown, but again, it's very rare. Certainly other communications associated with the event related to dams. Were you able to get in touch with the dam owner when you needed to? How was that, two-way communication? Were you talking the same language? Were you asking for things that he or she didn't understand, and vice versa? So again, any issues that might have had occurred during that event, let's work them out. And again, if any of these structures were damaged, we want to be out there. The Dam Bureau definitely will be following up to ensure that if the dam was damaged, it is in a, make sure that it's in a condition to continue to function. If not, we will order the owner to either lower the impoundment or make immediate repairs, etc. So, this last portion here on the screen really applies to the last slide relative to, during and monitoring. take notes, take photographs, make observations, because all of these little pieces of information together could inform you or others in making things better next time, or maybe even avoiding things. Again, provide any information to Homeland Security or DES so we can track it, because we have a database where we are putting in data like that. If we have information of a repetitive loss area, we want to know that, so that not only should you know about these if they're in your community, but we should know that about them as well, so that we can be informed and maybe inform you. There's a lot of turnover, as you might imagine, and as you know, in your communities. So a lot of this knowledge isn't transferred down the line when somebody leaves. And again, generate formal operations plans. It's always a good idea to see how things went. And then when everything has passed, say, okay, what could we have done better? Write it down so that you're not trying to remember this stuff again, or make it up on the fly, as you did perhaps this most recent time. So that's just a real thumbnail on ice jams and dams. Again, I covered before, during, and after, because I haven't participated in any of these webinars yet. So you get the full array. Hopefully you've gotten some information here, and I think, as Katie indicated, there's time for questions, and that will occur, I think, after everybody has presented. So thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, Steve. I believe Brendan is now gonna take over. Perfect. Are you all set, Brendan?
Yeah, if you can see what I'm looking at, the first page of my slide,
Yep.
New Hampshire Flood Hazard Handbook. All right.
Looks fantastic.
Great. All right. Well, thank you everybody for attending. I don't see anybody's faces, but it seems to be the norm nowadays. My name is Brendan Lynch. I'm a coastal resilience and flood mitigation specialist with the coastal program based out of Portsmouth for DES. I'm going to be covering the sections in the hazard handbook specific to extreme precipitation as well as sea level rise. The handbook has bits of data that have been updated in recent years by a collective effort put into the coastal flood risk guidance. So I will be kind of covering a little bit of the updated data as well, and pointing to some case studies in the area that have implemented that data into real life projects that have been successful. So flooding in New Hampshire has increased due to intensifying precipitation patterns as well as rising sea levels. It's not just a coastal problem, it's also inland as well. These incidents and increased levels are caused by climate change, and impacts are expected to worsen over this century, at least the next 100 years. The FEMA flood maps did not account for projected sea level rise or changes in precipitation, though these changes, like I just said, are expected to increase. So there we go. This graph you're looking at on the screen represents observed sea level rise since 1900, while also showing projected scenarios under different emission levels over the next century. In the past, mean sea level has been rising in New Hampshire due primarily to ocean warming, which causes the water to expand, and also melting of the land-based glaciers in the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets. Almost half of that rise since 1900 has occurred. Oh no, excuse me. Half of that rise has occurred since 1993. Excuse me. Future projections, best available science summarized in 2014 for New Hampshire, indicates that sea level rises are expected to rise between roughly 1/2 foot and 2 feet by the year 2050, and between roughly 1.5 feet and 6.5 feet by 2100. The wide range of projected sea levels is primarily due to uncertainty about future global greenhouse emissions, and the rate of that ice sheet melt. Sea levels are expected to continue to rise beyond 2100, but the graph that you're looking at only projects to 2100. So this slide shows the updated sea level rise data, specifically from the Coastal Flood Risk Summary, which was published in 2019. Relative sea level rise in New Hampshire is rising. It's risen by approximately 8 inches in the last 100 years. Relative to that, the rate of ice mass loss from the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets is accelerating, and it is now the primary contributor to sea level rise. In coastal New Hampshire, relative sea level rise is projected to rise for centuries. And prior to 2050, there are only minor differences, roughly, excuse me, roughly 0.2 feet among different relative sea level rise projections due to differences in the mass loss from ice sheets and the estimated greenhouse gas concentrations. Specifically, coastal New Hampshire is likely to experience about 0.5 foot to roughly 1.5 feet in the next 30 years if the greenhouse gas concentrations stabilize. After 2050, the relative sea level rise projections become increasingly dependent on those greenhouse gas concentrations, and there's a much larger range in relative sea level rise projections over the next 100 years. Sea level rise will continue for centuries. The rate of this continued rise will depend fundamentally on those ice sheets. Current and future impacts on New Hampshire coastal communities have already experienced increases in the sea level rise, and the upward trend is the trend through these slides is expected to accelerate and continue. Coastal communities should plan for more frequent high tide flooding, which will increase erosion. And coastal communities should also prepare for more damaging storms that extend further inland and bring deeper flood depths and stronger currents. So this box culvert that you see is a case study that I had mentioned. It's from Lubberland Creek in Newmarket, New Hampshire. This is a tidally influenced creek. And they incorporated the data, the updated data from 2019. And the goal of this site-specific project was to replace this tidally influenced undersized culvert, which would reduce flood risk and improve habitat. The undersized culvert, which unfortunately I could not find a picture of, but it was about 36 inches wide and 30 inches tall, so much smaller than what you're looking at here. The undersized culvert, it restricted the natural hydrology of the creek, and it was also a barrier to aquatic organisms. It was a corrugated metal pipe, presented public safety and problems with emergency access and evacuation concerns for the town when there were extreme precipitation events. That road, Bay Road, which crosses the creek, flooded at least 3 times in 2018 alone. And the project, the total replacement was completed in 2019. So that covered sea level rise. Now I'm going to move to the extreme precipitation data. In past data, the Northeast United States has experienced significant increases in the number of extreme precipitation events per year, with the number of 5-year, 2-day precipitation events, which is roughly a 20% probability of happening every year. That increased by 74% since 1900. The Northeast also has seen a 27% increase in the 5-year maximum daily precipitation over the same period. Future projections, the Northeast United States is projected to increase even more in frequency and the amount of precipitation. It's expected to increase 50 to 300% of the same 20% chance happening, the 5-year, 2-day precipitation events, compared to the historical average. The same region expects an increase between 14 and 22% in the amount of precipitation falling in the 20-year daily extreme precipitation events over the same time period. So those are a lot of confusing terms and probabilities. If anybody has any further questions, I'll be here at the end, and you'll have my contact information too, because it's a lot to wrap your head around, even for somebody who looks at it almost daily. And surprisingly enough, with the coastal flood risk guidance update, it was almost negligible, the data that was found between there wasn't much of a change from the 2014 publication to the 2019. So I didn't even include it here. because they were so similar. Another case study specific to Lee, New Hampshire. Let's see, I just lost my place, excuse me. This was a planning project specific to their floodplain ordinance, and they incorporated projections. And the goal of this planning project was to provide updates to the floodplain ordinance by understanding the spatial distribution of the future floodplain based on estimate increases in extreme precipitation. The final map that you're looking at here, titled Figure 6, depicts the current and potential future flooding extent and depth associated with the 1%, which is the 100-year flood for the following conditions. And excuse me, no, that's final thought. It's just the 100-year flood that you're looking at. And based on this study, the difference between the present day and future estimates, it increased the floodplain by roughly 35%. So just by incorporating the future projections, their floodplain increased quite a bit. And the town of Lee did vote to incorporate that ordinance, which was a positive result, and why I presented this case study. Here's some resources that I pulled from, and also the Flood Hazard Handbook and the Coastal Flood Risk Guidance, both incorporated. My contact information is right there. So again, I'll be on at the end of the meeting for any questions or comments that folks might have, and also available pretty much 8 to 4 every day if you're looking to talk about this in more detail. So thank you.
Okay, Shane, I see you're there, but you're muted.
Just caught that. Thanks, Katie.
Perfect.
I'm going to be very quick here. I'm just going to tell you very quickly about 2 data sets that we have in the state that are able to be used for flood hazard mitigation. A topic that Brendan just talked about, as well as there was a topic that Tim Mallett talked about on yesterday's webinar, is stream crossings after the Allstead flood in 2006. There was a flood study commission, and they recommended that the state of New Hampshire engage in a long-term project to assess each culvert in the state to identify its potential flood risk, potential for failure, as well as whether or not it's an impediment to fish passage upstream in a watershed context, and to identify its ability to pass a range of flows. So as of now, we have 12,605 culverts assessed in the state. Every black dot on that map you see is a assessed culvert. And you can see on the screen what the assessment data can be used for, as I was just outlining in the, as I was just mentioning a couple seconds ago. For instance, this is from the Upper Valley. On the right-hand side, you can see a picture of a culvert. This was prior to 2014, before it catastrophically failed. And this was on top of a slope, and you can see on the left the upsizing they did do it after the flood event. These are the kinds of events that we're trying to mitigate by understanding in a more statewide perspective where our most problematic culverts are located. As I mentioned, they are also a fish passage impediment. Culverts that are perched, which is where on the left-hand side of the screen, where the elevation of the culvert pipe is higher than the bed. Fish cannot get up that. We're trying to identify those situations as well. In the right-hand side, you can plainly see an example of a culvert that where it's basically crumbling, and that is a failure risk if you have a high flow event. This data is all available through the Aquatic Restoration Mapper hosted by DES. If you just go to DES's webpage and you go to the Resources Center and you click on the link for, we have a series of web mappers. This web mapper link is there. It's the Aquatic Restoration Mapper. You can scroll all around the state, click on a point where there's a culvert assessment data. You can look at the pictures for every culvert. You can look at the data for every culvert based on a statewide protocol that we have, as well as what its geomorphic compatibility, its compatibility with river form and process rating, fish passage compatibility. We also run every culvert through a hydraulic vulnerability tool to identify whether or not it can pass a range of flow, such as the 2-year, 10-year, 25, 50, 100-year flow. All that data is available for every culvert that we have assessed in the state on the Aquatic Restoration Mapper. The New Hampshire Geological Survey, which I serve as director of, has over the years, mainly my predecessor, Rick Corman, spearheaded the completion of the collection of 2-meter resolution LiDAR data for the entire state of New Hampshire. It's high resolution topographic information in the landscape. This is very relevant for use in flood mitigation and flood risk management. As a for instance, several years ago in 2018, there was an ice jam on the South Branch Piscataquag River in New Boston, and those town officials reached out to us for some technical assistance. And the blue line that you see there is the length of the ice jam. Upstream, which is in the left-hand lower left of that image, is the village of New Boston itself. And we actually were able to identify that the water backing up upstream of that jam, there was the capacity for flood storage and flood storage on the adjacent floodplain that would help mitigate any potential backwater effects into New Boston, because we had the high resolution LiDAR information to be able to make those calculations. So LiDAR is able to be used on the fly during and also after an event to identify what areas of flood risk are. This is an image from southwestern New Hampshire. The river and the floodplain in the upper left is the Cold River watershed. And this is an example where LiDAR can be used to identify, if you're trying to mitigate flood events, you have damage and you're trying to mitigate and replace infrastructure, gives you a very good idea of what is downstream, what's upstream, to try to replace infrastructure that's compatible with the river system that you're currently operating on. This is the Exeter River in southeastern New Hampshire. Just to illustrate another example, the FEMA floodplain delineations for the National Flood Insurance Program, they're now using this high resolution LiDAR to increase the precision and the accuracy of the maps that are being produced under their remapping for the National Flood Insurance Program. All this LiDAR data is available on Granite's website. UNH Granite is the state GIS clearinghouse. This data is all available for your own use. You can bring it into your own geographic information system. If you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me at the New Hampshire Geological Survey. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to the next presenter.
Great, thank you. So next, it's me again, Katie Pate. For those, my camera is glitchy. I don't know if that's just on my end, but I'm going to turn it off because I don't want the internet to be weird. But for yesterday, I did mention on the webinar that you'd be hearing my voice a lot throughout the series. So I'll leave that to you to determine if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But so again, my name is Katie Pate, and I'm from the State Floodplain Management Program within the Office of Planning and Development in the New Hampshire Department of Business and Economic Affairs. And we are the State Floodplain Management Program. Us being the State Floodplain Management Program, we are the state coordinating agency of the National Flood Insurance Program in New Hampshire. So we're going to briefly talk about the NFIP. So I'm going to start with a quick poll question. I'm just curious with everybody's familiarity with the National Flood Insurance Program. There's no right, there's no wrong answer. So the question is simply, how familiar are you with the National Flood Insurance Program? A, I've had lots of experience with the NFIP. B, I've had some experience with the NFIP. C, I've heard of it, but no experience. That's a spelling error. I should say not experience, no experience. And then the last answer is I have no experience, or I just heard of it maybe recently or today. If everybody doesn't mind submitting their answers. Again, we don't track. I don't know who answered, who didn't, or what answer you gave. It's purely just out of curiosity. So like the majority people either have had lots of experience or some experience. So that is good. Thank you all for answering that. I'm now going to close the poll. So let's jump right in. So the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP, you'll hear me refer to it throughout this presentation, is a voluntary partnership with FEMA that communities can volunteer to join and participate in. It is not required, though many towns and cities across New Hampshire and across the entire country do choose to participate. There are three main components of this program, which include floodplain mapping, floodplain regulations, and then flood insurance. We'll be briefly talking about all of those today and how they all fit together. That being said, I won't be going in depth on each of those, with every single detail. So if you are interested or have further questions on a specific topic, please feel free to reach out, as we can either do an individual training, we can provide you to past trainings that we have available, or just other resources we have as well. So for a community to participate in the NFIP, they agree to adopt and enforce local floodplain regulations that meet minimum NFIP requirements that are set forth by FEMA. And then flood insurance is made available for purchase for all property owners and residents, and that also includes renters, and it also includes businesses in that community that just agreed to participate. So in New Hampshire, 220 communities do participate in the NFIP, which is about 94%. On the map on the slide, it might be small on your screen, but all the towns and communities and cities that are in white, those are participating. And then all the other colors are non-participating communities. And if you're new to your community, or you're just new to the NFIP in general, and you're not sure if your community does participate, please feel free to reach out as well, because we're happy to let you know and then work with you further. So as I mentioned, there are three components to the NFIP. So again, there's floodplain mapping, floodplain regulations, and flood insurance. So we're first going to discuss floodplain mapping and knowing your risk. So flood insurance rate maps, or FIRMs, or flood maps, they're all commonly called those names, are produced by FEMA, and they show the different flood zones for an area. The flood maps also come with what's called flood insurance studies, or FIS reports, and those contain more information about the maps, the flood insurance rate maps. These maps have historically been released in New Hampshire in county-wide sets. So currently, for example, Rockingham County, Stratford County, Hillsborough County all have their own sets of maps. The only exception to this is Belknap County, which has the oldest sets of maps in New Hampshire, and those are actually community-specific maps. But that will be changing in the near future, as there are many mapping projects to have new maps going on throughout the state. So just a minute ago, I mentioned that communities adopt local floodplain regulations in return for the availability of flood insurance in their community. So while those FIRMs, again, the flood insurance rate maps, those are used by community officials to determine which areas of the community are subject to their floodplain development regulations, which then in turn determines what building requirements apply for development in the floodplain area. Additionally, the FIRMs are used by lenders to determine which properties are required flood insurance and the condition of their mortgage. And FIRMs can also be used by the general public or residents if they're just trying to understand flood risk in either their area or a particular area that they have interest in. So what is shown on these flood insurance rate maps and the FIS reports? So this is what is shown as the 1% annual chance flood. And this is the magnitude flood that has a 1% chance of happening in any given year. And these areas of the 1% chance flood is called special flood hazard areas, or SFHA. So the special flood hazard areas on the maps are then divided into those different flood zones. These zones start with either the letters A or V. So A is in alpha or V is in victory. Zones starting with the letter A can be found across the state, while zones starting with the letter V are only found right along the coast. And then there's another zone called Zone X, and these are the areas outside of the special flood hazard area. So meaning Zone X are areas where that 1% annual chance flood is not identified on the map. So a few other things shown on the FIRMs is base flood elevations, floodways, and limwas. So a base flood elevation, or it's really commonly called, you'll hear it's called BFE, is the height to which the flood water would be expected to rise in the 1% annual chance flood event. And that's really important because that ties into communities' floodplain regulations that they have adopted. Additionally, there are floodways or regulatory floodways, and these are found along some rivers and streams. And a regulatory floodway is the channel of a river or adjacent land areas that must be reserved in order to discharge that base flood without increasing the water surface elevation. And then it also makes sense, this is also where the fastest moving water will flow during that 1% chance flood event. So for that reason, many communities have higher restrictions in floodways and regulatory floodways because that's where the majority of the water will be flowing at its fastest speed, or velocity, I should say, excuse me. And then finally, the last thing that's shown on the map that we're just going to talk about today is called LMWAS, or the limit of moderate wave action. And this is shown in coastal areas. And the LMWAS indicate coastal A zones. And those are areas that receive 1.5 feet or higher of breaking waves during that 1% annual chance flood event. So the maps, I know they have a lot of information. It can be kind of overwhelming if you're not used to looking at them. Again, please always reach out to us if you have questions or you want any clarification, if we're more than happy to work with communities on understanding the maps as well. Okay, so we talked about floodplain mapping, so now let's move on to the second component of the NFIP, which is floodplain regulations. So as I've already stated earlier in this presentation, a community must adopt and enforce floodplain regulations that meet at least the minimum requirements of the program in order to remain in good standing. It is up to the community to take ownership of their floodplain regulations by fully understanding and enforcing the requirements that those regulations contain. But that being said, even when the town's regulations are followed to a T, it doesn't mean that those areas are completely safe from flooding. Buildings can still suffer damage during a flooding event. Reasons for this may be that there has been development changes in the floodplain due to either placement of fill, excavation, storage of materials, or building of structures, just to name some examples. And then this would then change the flow where the water would move. So that would potentially, change and potentially change the flow of the water during a flooding event, and a building or a structure could be damaged. Additionally, the flood insurance rate maps, they focus on that 1% annual chance flood, but larger and more severe floods can and do happen. At the same time, less severe floods can and do happen, but when those larger and more severe floods can and do happen, damage can occur from that as well. So for these reasons, there are several communities throughout New Hampshire that have chosen to adopt higher standards that go beyond these minimums to try to reduce that damage. So one requirement that is included in all participating communities' floodplain regulations is that all proposed development in a special flood hazard area, again, that's the 1% annual chance flood as indicated on that flood insurance rate map. So any development in those areas shall require a local permit and meet the building requirements of the regulations. And this also includes building and non-building development as well. So it's not just a new structure, it includes non-building, which could be grading, paving, dredging, filling, storage of equipment and materials, etc. So this is especially important to remember after disaster or when a flooding event occurs, and maybe there's more rebuilding that's occurring, or there's just additional development that's going on in the floodplain as the community recovers from that event. Responding and rebuilding after an event can be a very difficult and overwhelming time, though it's important to ensure that if a structure is being rebuilt, it is being rebuilt so to better withstand this type of event in the future, and then following the community's floodplain regulations. And this also includes the requirement of substantial damage, which we'll talk about in the coming slides as well. So minimum requirements that are included in each participating community's floodplain regulations include requirements for new construction and substantial improvements as well. And for those who aren't familiar what a substantial improvement are, substantial improvements come into play when improvements are performed on a structure and the cost of those improvements are equal or greater than 50% of the structure's market value prior to the start of the improvement. It's a determination that communities are responsible to make, and then if that determination is met, the structure must be brought into compliance as if it were a new structure. So again, requirements that are included in the local floodplain regulations for new construction or substantial improvements include elevation requirements for residential structures, floodproofing requirements for non-residential structures, requirements that prohibit basements. A basement's defined by the NFIP as an area with all four sides below grade. The regulations also include requirements of enclosures that would be below that BFE, so that's the base flood elevation, indicating what what use can be used below that BFE, and then also what would be the required flood openings. And then there's also requirements for anchoring and elevation of utilities, water, and sewer. So I know that can be a lot, and we're not going into specifics of those today, but we've had several other trainings on that in the past, and we'll be holding them in the future, and we have other resources. So please, again, reach out if you're interested in learning more. So in relation to the topic of really after the flood, as today's webinar is themed, substantial damage is an important component of a community's floodplain regulations. So substantial damage is a determination that must be made when a structure has received damage from any origin and the cost of restoring the structure to its before damage condition is greater than or equal to 50% of the market value of the structure before the damage occurred. No, it's a mouthful. Similar to substantial improvement, this determination is done by the community, and it's important to know that this is the market value of the structure itself, not including the land. And also it's important to know that the damage for substantial damage can be from any origin. It's not just flooding. It can be, obviously flooding, it can be fire, it can be from a tornado, an earthquake. I know those aren't as common in New Hampshire, but they certainly do happen as well. So if a structure is determined to be substantially damaged, the structure must be brought into compliance with the community's floodplain regulations as if it was a new structure, a new construction. So this is especially important to remember in regards to older structures, because this could mean, for example, having to elevate the structure, filling a basement, or raising utilities if that substantial damage threshold was met and it was going to be brought into compliance. FEMA does have a substantial improvement and substantial damage desk reference available that can be a very helpful resource as well. So let's briefly talk about two other resources that may be available after a post-flooding event. So the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018 authorizes FEMA to provide assistance to state and local governments for building code and floodplain administration and enforcement. And this includes inspections for substantial damage compliance for a period of no more than 180 days after the major disaster is declared. Additionally, flood insurance policyholders in high-risk flood areas, which means they're in that special flood hazard area. So again, the 1% annual chance flood as indicated on that flood insurance rate map. So if policyholders of flood insurance through the NFIP in those areas may receive up to $30,000 to help offset the cost to bring that home or business into compliance with their community's floodplain regulations. And this is called an increased cost of compliance coverage, so ICC coverage, and that is actually a part of their flood insurance policy. And the only key note about that to remember is that that ICC coverage is only available when the structure has been substantially damaged, and that is determined again by the local community. So that ICC coverage is not available at any time. It can only be available again when that substantial damage has been determined. So we talked about floodplain mapping, we talked about floodplain regulations. Now let's move on to the last component of the NFIP, which is flood insurance. So we always recommend flood insurance, whether you live in that special flood hazard area or not, because flooding can happen anywhere it rains. For NFIP communities, anyone in the community can purchase flood insurance through the NFIP. Many people don't realize that flooding is not typically covered under traditional home insurance policies. And then there's also, you might hear of grants or other things that are available after large flooding events, but those often require a presidential declaration where flood insurance does not. So that flood insurance can cover you in a small event when only like two or a few properties are affected versus needing a large enough event that you need that presidential declaration for. So there are times when flood insurance is required, and that is if it is a condition of a federally backed mortgage. So lending institutions utilize the FEMA flood maps, so those flood insurance rate maps, and then they look at those identified special flood hazard areas to determine if a property is, need to be required flood insurance. And it is the responsibility of the lender or someone working for the lender to determine if a specific property is subject to that requirement. So if flood insurance would be and if so, then the flood insurance would be required for the life of that loan or that mortgage or whatever that money was being used for. And then once the loan or the mortgage was paid off, the property owner could then choose whether to continue having flood insurance or not at their own choice. So if you're new to flood insurance can be purchased through your current insurance company or professional, just like you would purchase home or auto insurance. Flood insurance premiums are calculated through FEMA's risk rating engine, which takes into account a combination of factors and data sources rather than just the FEMA flood maps. It's kind of funny because the FEMA flood maps are called flood insurance rate maps, but they're actually not used to determine insurance premiums anymore. But anyway, so these factors that go into that insurance premium calculation include things such as the structure's distance to a flooding source, ground elevation, building characteristics, replacement building costs, coverage, whatever your chosen deductible is. So it's really dependent on the structure itself, and your flood insurance premium is based off your specific risk, which may be different than your neighbor's specific risk or somebody down the street. And the other thing that's really important is that anyone who lives in a participating community can purchase flood insurance through the NFIP. They don't have to be in that special flood hazard area or not. As long as their community participates, they are eligible to purchase. So another thing to remember is that even though we're talking about flood insurance right here in this moment, your community's floodplain regulations apply for the entire community for any development in that special flood hazard area, regardless of whether or not the property has flood insurance. It can be a common misconception that if regulations only apply if you have flood insurance on that property, and that's incorrect. Any development in that special flood hazard area, whether it has flood insurance or not, needs to follow your community's floodplain regulations. So as we wrap up here, there are a few key takeaway items to remember. The first is to ensure that your community's floodplain regulations are being followed and enforced. You may also want to be aware of the substantial damage requirements and then be prepared to make those determinations after a disaster or if a flooding event is to occur. Also be sure to have an effective permit and enforcement process in place for development in the special flood hazard area. This is especially important for communities that traditionally maybe have very little floodplain development, but then have an uptick in development after an event when rebuilding is occurring. A community should also be familiar with your flood insurance rate maps and then your FIST report, and then be aware of areas that are at a higher risk of flooding in your community. It may be beneficial for some communities to develop a list of structures that are located in the special flood hazard area prior to a disaster or flooding occurring. So then you know which properties are at the highest risk, and you know which properties would also need a substantial damage termination if an event or flooding were to occur. And then the last slide here, this is just the contact information for the State Floodplain Management Program. As well, you'll see Jennifer Gilbert, she's our administrator, and then you'll see myself listed below. Feel free if you have any follow-up questions or just at any time with the NFIP to reach out to us. We're always happy to help and talk to everybody. So with that, I think we're going to move it on to our representatives from FEMA to speak.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Happy to be participating in this webinar. I'm going to put my contact information in the chat. I don't think there's a slide that says it, but my name is Marcus Tate. I'm in our regional's non-disaster team. I supervise the team that handles the non-disaster grants, which we'll be talking about in this presentation. So without further ado, this is going to be a very quick overview of several programs we offer that are pretty comprehensive. So I do encourage questions, during the meeting or after to follow up. So it's going to be a quick overview. We're going to talk about, general eligibility, who typically applies, cost share information, some basic requirements, general activities that we perform here in Region 1, the common ones, and then some resources to help you, identify what these programs and if they're right for you and your communities. So very generally, hazard mitigation, a sustained action taken to reduce or eliminate risk to human life threat, property from a hazard event. Very simply, if you have an area in your community that's consistently being damaged from storm events, we want to improve it. The culverts being upsized, armoring of embankments, those are pretty common. Generators, those are the pretty common ways to achieve that mitigation. So we in our region offer some non-disaster, we call because they're not based on funding that's generated from a disaster declaration. The Flood Mitigation Assistance Program and the BRIC, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program, those are both our non-disasters that are competitively based, where notice of funding opportunities are announced and communities can apply. Those are generally, I think, every about September. There's the application period for those that lasts about 4 months. We just recently, we're in the midst of sort of the beginning stages of our current year for those two programs. But every year, Congress puts out a set of funding based on the overall disaster fund to go into those programs. That's all incorporated into that notice of funding opportunity. The FMA program is really more focused on avoiding flood damages and specific structures that are insured under the NFIP. We do a lot of elevations under that program, residential elevations especially. And then the BRIC program is new to the last few years. That's really they want to consider it a more robust infrastructure-based project where it's like really large scale, based on capability and capacity building throughout the communities. And then the HMGP program is the one that's our disaster program. That's based on a percentage of funding for every disaster declaration. And they're sporadic. Usually, we do get some, our winter events tend to produce some disasters. We recently provided a lot of funding for COVID, which was a unique situation because typically they're based on storm events, but in this case, based on the COVID funding we gave communities and states, we were able to provide some HMGP funding, which was sort of an unprecedented amount in a lot of states. But it's typically based on storm events, and I think there's currently a few going on in New Hampshire, and based on a recent storm, there's assessments that could produce one in the future. So let's see. I touched on the non-disaster programs a little bit already. Some of those basic requirements. Like I said, the FMA is flood only. We can also do mitigation plans that directly benefit NFIP insured properties, where the BRIC is a little bit more open-ended, a little bit more comprehensive. It did replace a program called PDM, the pre-disaster mitigation, which, even though that has sunsetted for the annual appropriations, they're still congressionally dictated PDM projects that I won't get into here. It's a little bit more complicated, but the communities basically reach out directly to their state congressional representative to request similar projects that would be funded under these non-disaster programs to improve infrastructure. The HMGP, as I discussed, is available after major disasters, where the governor makes a request after a storm to do an assessment, and if those assessments reach a threshold of allotted funding for the communities, then a disaster gets declared, and then HMGP money is available throughout the state. So typically, who applies for all of these grants? FEMA will work directly with who we call the applicant. Those are typically the state agency, the Homeland Security and Emergency Management in New Hampshire, or a federally recognized tribe, if there are any in those states. Those are the agencies and organizations that would receive the funding and sort of help us manage the grants with the sub-applicants, who are typically local communities, but also can be other state agencies, tribes, and for HMGP, private nonprofits. Private nonprofits are not eligible to apply under the non-disaster programs. The basic requirements are you must have a plan, and that varies a little bit and it can be complicated, but for HMGP, your local or multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan has to be in place by the time project, but for the non-disaster programs, that plan has to be in place before you apply by the application deadline. So it's a little bit different for the different programs we offer. Most projects require a benefit cost analysis, which is a long, complicated conversation in and of itself. And that's typically for like the construction related projects, planning grants. They don't require, and there's a few other types of grants we offer that do not require a cost effectiveness review, but if it's construction related, it would. Technical feasibility and effectiveness, us basically making sure that it's providing a increased level of protection and it's having a mitigation value. We can't really replace things apples to apples. If you had a 4-foot culvert there before and it's just old and dilapidated, we can't go in and pay for another 4-foot culvert. It has to be an improvement, and it has to be technically feasible. It has to be effective, meaning it can't really cause a cascade of impacts. In the culvert example, if you increase the size of one location, we have to make sure that you're not compounding issues and, increasing damages downstream or creating an impact to the floodplains where you're increasing the level, the base flood elevation. Those are the kinds of things we review to make sure are copacetic for our reviews. There's EHP requirements. If it's historic, if there's endangered species, if it's in wetlands, floodplains, those resources are reviewed by EHP staff. And NFIP requirements, we also follow, similar to what Katie was mentioning in her presentation. So the cost share, typically our cost shares are 75% provided by FEMA with 25% provided by the sub-applicant. HMGP, it's almost always the case. There are very select rare instances where we increase the cost shares to 90-10, 90 federal, but it's not not a regular situation. We did it for COVID, but it's all up to our headquarters and Congress when that does happen. For the non-disaster, though, there's a more prescriptive way of increasing the cost shares. For brick, you can increase it to 90-10 if the community is small or impoverished. And these terms and sort of the parameters have changed throughout the years, but currently you're in a small or impoverished community if your population is less than, I think, 3,000 people, and that average per capita income is less than 80% of the national per capita income. And then for the FMA program, if you have a repetitive loss property or severe repetitive loss, it could even, in severe repetitive loss, be up to 100% entirely covered by FEMA. And in those situations, it's based on previous damages and the amounts that those damages have, inflicted on the property. I believe repetitive loss is at least 2 damage events where the cost average equaled or exceeded 25% of the market value of the structure. And then severe repetitive loss is 4 insurance claim where each of those claims were at least $5,000, with the cumulative amounts being, I think, 20,000, and having two claims exceed the cumulatively exceed the market value of the property. So it can be complicated, but there are situations where those federal shares can be increased for properties that have just really had a hard time And we do also offer management costs for both the recipient and the sub-recipient or the sub-applicant to manage the grants, and those are at a higher cost share as well. So typically eligible activities in our region, these are all acquisitions, elevations. Those are common. Dry flood proofing. We do a lot of pump stations where you're going to dry proof some of the utilities, elevate them above sort of the BFE. We do a lot of generators. The flood risk reduction, localized and non-localized, those are sort of your drainage projects, culvert upgrades, maybe replacements and repairs to levee systems, revetments, stone walls, things of that nature. We don't do a lot of safe room construction just by the nature of the storms we get, or even wind retrofit. Those are more common in other parts of the country. But we do a lot of soil stabilizations where we're armoring embankments. We do a lot of planning related activities. A lot of communities use our grants to either start new ones or update their local hazard mitigation plans, or improve them where they're focusing on a specific area to do a risk assessment. Those are planning related activities that we can allow for incorporation into the local plans. And then some of our programs offer some specific activities. With the BRIC program allows building code projects where you're sort of identifying and coming up to speed and up to date for building codes and things of that nature. Project scoping is a category where we sort of, if you have an area that is damaged and you want to do something at a location that's being damaged consistently, we can give you money to do project scoping where you sort of flush out the best course of action to mitigate those damages. And then 5% projects are offered under HMGP, which are a little bit unique. And those are a lot of hazard identification, a lot of mapping, and education and outreach can also be funded under 5%, where you want to have a plan to go educate communities about the benefits of mitigation. Those could be incorporated in a 5% initiative type of project. So I know it's a lot to take in. It's a lot of information. We do have guidance documents, templates even for applications that we call plug and play applications that we can provide you that, we have they're not for every single project type, but we have a lot of them, available where you can get an idea of the types of documentation that are needed for the different applications. I don't think she's on the webinar, but the state hazard mitigation officer, Natasha Cole, she's really our main point of contact where we communicate with her regularly on sort of any things that are coming up, grant related in the States, any questions, we communicate with Natasha. We offer a lot of trainings. Usually they're requested by the state. So if your communities, if there's anyone who wants to know more about our programs and sort of the application process, we can provide a more localized one-on-one type of training. And aside from the trainings, there are a lot of job aids and checklists and fact sheets that we can also provide to you. I've put not necessarily a link, but a website at the bottom there that will go directly to a lot of these job aids that are really helpful in identifying, eligibility factors and more information that we're looking for when, applying for our grants. And then some of the online training you can take. FEMA has a facility called the Emergency Management Institute where you can go in person in Emmitsburg, Virginia, or Emmitsburg, Maryland, excuse me. But also, you can go online and access a lot of the training courses as well. And a lot of them the more relevant ones have to do with, application development, application reviewing, and how to implement projects once you receive an award and grant from FEMA and things of that nature. So I think that's plenty of information for now, but I'll be on at the end if there's any specific questions, and available anytime moving forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And now I believe we have Donna Nelson from FEMA. Here she
Yes.
is.
I'm here. Hopefully you can see me and hear me, and I'll be as quick as possible. But you know what I'm going to do? I am going to shut my camera off just to make sure my connection stays. So, okay, my name is Donna Nelson. I am with the Individual Assistance Program with FEMA. I am an emergency management specialist. I've been with FEMA for almost 12 years now. And I did previously work in hazard mitigation and with the National Flood Insurance Program, so I'm very familiar with flood management. So I really appreciate your presentations today. It's very informative and very helpful. It's like coming home. But my job today is to give you an overview of what is provided when there is a disaster declaration and it affects individual household owners or property owners. Let's see. Katie, can you move the slide, or I'm
Yeah, there should be, do you see a take control button at the top of your screen?
Oh, yes, excuse me. Okay, there we go. Okay.
Perfect.
So
I see it moving.
Yep. Yes. I'm a little rusty on this, but and excuse my voice, I have a little bit of allergies affecting me. But anyway, the overview of the Individual Assistance Program is our mission is to really ensure that individual and families affected by disasters have access to FEMA assistance following a presidential disaster declaration. And I'll go in very briefly, I'll give you an overview of the disaster declaration process. And our authority as a federal agency is through the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, as well as the recent updates that provide us with statutory authority for disaster response activities and legal requirements, and as well as a system for providing financial and direct assistance to states. And as you know, there are updates to this law. I think, Katie, you referenced the update to the amendment of 2018, which has provided additional assistance to FEMA. Now, under the federal regulations, the declaration process, let's see here. Did I skip the slide? Nope, I didn't. I'll just keep on going. Let me go over the declaration process, where really briefly, I won't read you the whole slide, but an incident occurs, such as a flood event, and then the state will work with FEMA and or tribe to do a preliminary damage assessment, or PDA, and based on the PDA's results, then the state or the tribe might request a federal disaster declaration for either public assistance or individual assistance. Then it will go to the FEMA Region 1 with the recommendation, and the Region 1 will make a recommendation to our headquarters and on to the president, and that's where the president will make that declaration. And I believe New Hampshire just received a declaration for public assistance only for the December 22nd, 24th storm that just occurred, but not for individual assistance. Now, for individual assistance or IA programs, all IA programs must be authorized once a major disaster declaration has been declared. That's why you may hear in the media that it will be a presidential disaster declarations just for public assistance, which is public infrastructure, which includes highways, bridges, etc., and also may authorize hazard mitigation statewide. So that's the type of declaration that New Hampshire currently has, but individual assistance needs to be authorized within, or at least approved in that declaration. And right now, New Hampshire did not qualify for individual assistance under that declaration. But now the programs, now if individual assistance was requested, the programs that may be authorized that the state would ask for would be individual and housing assistance, or IHP, disaster case management, or DCM, crisis counseling program, CCP, disaster unemployment assistance, which is DUA, and disaster legal services, which is DLS. So again, this is a good summary slide, which gives you an overview of pre and post individual assistance disaster declaration activities. So before and during a disaster, individual assistance would provide mass care and emergency assistance. It would also support voluntary organizations active in disasters, or VOAD, and would assist with preliminary damage assessments, working in coordination with the state and local communities. Now, after a major disaster declaration in which individual assistance is part of the declaration, and the declaration is specific to that, to the programs, it would include the individuals and housing program, which provides housing assistance and other needs assistance, the community services programs, which I gave a little bit of an overview of that, and I'll get to those in a minute, and then the voluntary organizations active in disaster. And New Hampshire does have an active group that supports the VOAD. Now, mass care and emergency assistance does include sheltering, feeding, emergency supplies, reunification of individuals, supporting those with disabilities and those with access and functional needs, support of mass evacuations if needed, and then providing assistance for those with household pets and service and support animals, and even agricultural animals as well. And the state of New Hampshire, in coordination, we work directly with the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, has plans in place for working on mass care and emergency assistance if needed. Now, the Individual and Households Program provides direct financial assistance to those affected by a disaster, say by a flood, and it is designed to address physical losses, housing needs, and critical expenses. But the thing is, with IHP, it's not a substitute for insurance and cannot compensate for all losses caused by a disaster. It really is to meet basic needs to make sure that property owners are safe, secure, and sanitary. So again, some of the assistance may not completely replace, say, somebody's TV room, but at least will get people in their homes so that they can at least get back to somewhat of a normal schedule. So the general conditions for IHP eligibility is that an applicant must be a U.S. citizen, non-citizen, or qualified alien, and that FEMA must be able to verify the applicant's identity, and that the applicant's disaster corps needs must be uninsured or underinsured. And the applicant's needs are directly the result of that specific disaster or presidentially declared disaster. And also, too, an applicant, if it's a flood situation, the applicant must be in compliance, whoops, there's a typo, with flood insurance requirements when applicable. So that would be something that we would look at when someone is applying directly to FEMA during the registration process, whether or not they do have flood insurance. Now, also, too, if somebody needs to purchase flood insurance, FEMA will directly purchase group flood insurance policies on behalf of applicants who are required to purchase and maintain flood insurance, but who may not otherwise be able to purchase the policy. So the premium for a 3-year coverage is about $2,400 and counts towards an applicant's other needs assistance, which is part of the IHP package. So there is some involvement of the IHP program with the National Flood Insurance Program. So some of the other IHP assistance for eligible survivors would be temporary housing, rental assistance, reimbursement of hotel costs, possibly a temporary housing unit if the disaster situation causes a lack of available housing resources. Like this happens quite often when there's a tornado and local available housing has been destroyed, so they'll bring in temporary housing units. We may also provide funds for repair, replacement of owner-occupied homes, of primary residences, and that's important too, that we do not provide assistance to secondary homes. only to primary residences. And some of that assistance could include privately owned access routes such as driveways, roads, and bridges in specific instances. Also, too, we can help with uninsured or underinsured disaster-caused expenses or serious needs, replacement of personal property, vehicles, and funds for moving and storage and other necessities. And believe it or not, we do provide funds now for hazard mitigation assistance to do some minor mitigations, such as roof repair, temporary roof repair for withstand higher winds or prevent additional water infiltration. Also elevating water heater or furnace to avoid future flood damage, and elevating or moving an electrical panel to avoid future flood damage. Now, this is a recent change in our IHP policies, where many years ago they did have a individual assistance mitigation program, and then it was sunsetted, and then they've just recently brought that back. But again, it's on a case-by-case, as-needed basis. And these are just simple repairs that would help, again, a homeowner to get back into their primary residence. So again, the changes that were just made with mitigation were a result of the 2018 Disaster Relief and Reform Act. And also, too, in addition to that, to those changes with providing mitigation assistance, was also an increase in the amount of money that an eligible survivor could receive. And that is that, for instance, there is both a pot of money for housing assistance, or HA, and there's also money available for what we call other needs assistance. So a maximum grant, an eligible survivor could potentially receive up to $82,000 in assistance for this current fiscal year. Now, the other needs assistance, that program can include transportation, repair, like repairing a damaged car, even replacing a car, or other funds available for transportation. It could be funeral assistance, child care, and other additional household items that would make a residence livable. And that's an important program, in that the state does pay a cost share on that program, which is usually 75% federal and 25% paid by the state. The other programs in IHP that I previously mentioned are 100% FEMA funded. So that is what is called direct federal assistance. So the housing assistance, again, is direct 100% FEMA funded, but other needs assistance does have a cost share. Now, some of the additional IA programs funded by FEMA, again, 100% FEMA funded, is the disaster case management, which is long-term, managing a survivor's case and all the different resources they may need to get back on their feet. The crisis counseling program becomes available to everyone in the state when there is an individual assistance declaration. Anyone can sign up for crisis counseling to help cope with the stress of, say, a disaster situation, and that program is worked through in combination with the Emergency Management Agency and I believe the Health and Human Services Agency in New Hampshire. And the Disaster Unemployment Assistance is through the State Department of Labor. And we have federal agreements with them, and we work directly with the state agency. And Disaster Legal Services is in conjunction with a volunteer, a Young Lawyers Association. And I think I have a slide on that, which goes in a little bit of detail. Oh, no, I don't. But those programs are coordinated with the Department of Emergency Management and with our offices in Region 1. But all these programs are outlined in the Individual Assistance Program and Policy Guide, and the links are on here. If you click on the link here on FEMA.gov, you can look up and just put in individual assistance or the policy guide, and you will get this information. Oops. And let's see, and I think I'm at the end here for questions.
I think you are. Do you have any final things, or?
Yep. No, I don't think so.
Okay.
And well, I'll put my contact information in the chat box.
Perfect. And I'm also going to send a follow-up email to all the attendees once we have all 3 webinar recordings available, where I'll be putting the copy of the slides for each of the presentations, the link to the recordings, and I'll also include everybody's contact information that did speak throughout the series as well. So, but yes, please feel free to grab Donna's from there if you'd like it from the chat. So I know we're 2 minutes of time. Are there any questions? I haven't seen any in the chat. Feel free to enter any there, or if you do have a question, you can use the raise hand feature to ask that verbally, and I can unmute you if there are any. We'll give it a second to see if any come in. Okay. I'm not seeing any hands raised. Again, you can get the presentations, excuse me, the presenters' contact information either in the chat, but I will send that up as a follow-up with the slides and everything. So if something comes up later, obviously you can reach out to them or you can reach out to me and I will connect you with the right person. So just as a last step here before we sign off for the day, again, I just want to thank you all for coming and attending and for those participating. Oh, Brendan has a question or comment.
Yeah, I actually have a question for Marcus.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, so we're working in real quick, and I can talk with you and give you a call or email, but we're working with the town of Hampton, developing a elevation and acquisition program for them to start identifying properties. Would it be more appropriate to work through Natasha for that type of information and we do plan on including her in the development of this program. But is it also something that FEMA could be directly involved with or provide assistance with?
Yeah, definitely coordinate with Natasha, but our staff, non-disaster and disaster, because you could apply under either program. We could definitely participate in, technical assistance calls or, meetings to help flush out, anything really, like the best way to apply, the best way to identify. We usually don't get too involved in identifying the resources themselves.
Right.
We would leave that to you guys as the experts, certainly in your state. But yeah, reach out to Natasha, and I would certainly say my staff, and I would like to say the HMGP staff as well, like would be available for any questions to help along the way. In the event that you get to the point where you're ready to apply for, FEMA grants.
All right, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Perfect. So yeah, just as follow-up, I will be sending this all out. Our part 1 will be happening tomorrow, since we did reschedule it from Tuesday. So if you're already registered, please feel free to join using the link you got in your email. If not, I did put the link in the chat as well. And then just before we close real quick, just like yesterday, if everybody before they sign off could just rate this webinar 1 out of 5 stars, it really does help us in improving our training as well in the future. And besides that, that's all I have. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow for part 1, even though it's coming last. And have a good afternoon.